In February 2024, Buckingham Palace released a statement that stopped the nation in its tracks. King Charles III, a monarch who had waited decades to wear the crown, was diagnosed with cancer. The revelation came not in a sweeping public address, but as a carefully worded update after what was initially described as a routine procedure for an enlarged prostate. For years, Charles had cultivated an image of strength, steady, composed, unshakable. But now, the truth was harder to contain. Behind the ornate palace walls, the weight of the monarchy began to shift, and with that shift came a silent wave of fear. The diagnosis sent shock waves through Britain, not just because of the king's age or condition, but because of what it symbolized: vulnerability at the very top. The type of cancer was never disclosed, only referred to vaguely as something caught early. The lack of detail was no accident. In a world where optics are everything, uncertainty breeds speculation. Was the cancer aggressive? Could he rule for much longer? Was a succession already being discussed behind closed doors? These weren't just idle questions from tabloids, they echoed through Parliament, across the press, and into living rooms across the UK. Suddenly, a nation already rattled by years of royal turbulence found itself bracing for yet another seismic upheaval. But even as his health was questioned, King Charles refused to step back. He resumed his state duties mere weeks after his diagnosis was made public, making brief but deliberate appearances that were clearly calculated. Smiling for cameras, shaking hands, whispering reassurances through gritted teeth. It wasn't just about duty, it was about defiance. He knew that stepping down too early could create chaos, but he also knew time might not be on his side. Inside the palace, contingency plans were quietly reactivated plans no monarch ever wants to acknowledge. Advisors and aides worked tirelessly behind the scenes, rehearsing a future where the crown would pass on earlier than expected. Not out of choice, but necessity. The idea that Charles, who had waited nearly 3/4 of a century to take the throne, might serve for only a brief window was almost too cruel to imagine. And yet, that was the looming reality. Still, amidst this crisis, the royal family projected calm. Queen Camilla stood firm, offering a supportive presence by the king's side. Prince William, ever the dutiful heir, stepped up his public responsibilities. But behind every forced smile and public appearance was a pressing urgency. The monarchy could not afford to look weak, not now, not again. As the public absorbed the implications of the king's diagnosis, another figure within the royal orbit was quietly navigating her own private turmoil. She had stood beside William in times of joy and tragedy. She had endured press scrutiny, invasive speculation, and relentless comparisons to a mother-in-law she never met. And now, she was about to reveal something that would change everything once again. In March 2024, the palace released a statement that silenced every room in Britain. Princess Catherine, the beloved Princess of Wales, had been diagnosed with cancer. The world was stunned. For years, she had been the picture of elegance, grace, and quiet strength. But now, behind her composed smile, she was fighting a battle more personal and more perilous than any royal duty could ever prepare her for. In a monarchy built on image and restraint, Catherine did something almost unthinkable. She told the truth. Her announcement came not through a traditional royal press release, but in a carefully filmed video that broke every rule of palace protocol. Her voice was calm, but her message was raw. She spoke of her diagnosis, of beginning preventative chemotherapy, and of the emotional weight that came with sharing such deeply personal news. There was no spin, no vague statements, just truth. For a royal to admit weakness, let alone illness, was nearly unprecedented. But Catherine wasn't asking for sympathy. She was leading by example. And in doing so, she shattered generations of silence surrounding health in the royal family. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across Britain and far beyond, people rallied behind her. Cancer patients, survivors, and families flooded social media with messages of solidarity. News anchors choked up on live broadcasts. Even the tabloids, so often ruthless in their coverage of the royals, stepped back if only for a moment and offered respect. Catherine had done what few had dared to do. She humanized royalty. She reminded the world that beneath the pearls and protocols, she too was vulnerable, and in doing so, she gave strength to countless others. As the months wore on, she underwent chemotherapy quietly, away from the cameras, her absence from public events sparking endless speculation. Yet through it all, her silence became its own kind of power. It was not a retreat, it was a recalibration. She was no longer just the supportive wife or the photogenic mother of a future king. She was now something far more formidable, a survivor. And when, in September 2024, she announced the completion of her chemotherapy, there was a collective sigh of relief, one that echoed from Kensington Palace to hospital wards around the country. By January 2025, Catherine had entered remission, but she didn't return to her royal duties the way she left them. She came back transformed, stronger, sharper, more determined, and she didn't waste time. Her appearances began to carry new weight, not just because of her title, but because of what she had endured. She became an outspoken advocate for early detection, for accessible treatment, for emotional resilience in the face of illness. Her public speeches, once reserved and poised, now carried a quiet urgency. She had found her voice, and the world listened. But as her health stabilized and her platform grew, something else began to shift. Her role within the royal family, once limited to tradition and support, was quietly expanding. There were whispers behind palace doors, discussions not meant for public ears, because while Catherine had faced her battle in silence, what came next would thrust her into a position no one had fully anticipated. Emerging from the depths of her illness, Princess Catherine didn't just return to the public eye, she redefined it. The same woman who had faced down one of life's cruelest battles now stood at the center of a nation's admiration, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more powerful. But it wasn't a throne or title that marked this transformation. It was something quieter, something planted, something that would bloom. The Royal Horticultural Society, known for its strict traditions and historical reverence, unveiled a new rose, a coral pink floribunda, soft yet bold, delicate yet unbreakable, named simply and profoundly, Catherine's Rose. This wasn't just a garden variety tribute. The rose had been carefully cultivated by Harkness roses and chosen for more than its beauty. Its fragrance subtle, with hints of Turkish delight, spoke of refinement, but its very creation carried deeper meaning. Every purchase of Catherine's rose would support the Royal Marsden Cancer Charity, the very institution that had once stood beside her in her darkest days. It was a full-circle moment, a living emblem of her journey, a silent testament to the pain she had endured, the strength she had harnessed, and the healing she now shared with others. When the rose made its debut at the prestigious RHS Chelsea Flower Show in May 2025, it wasn't just about horticulture, it was a cultural shift. The Princess of Wales was no longer just a figure of grace. She had become a symbol of resilience. Amid the manicured displays and royal fanfare, her rose stood not as decoration, but declaration. Nature, once her personal refuge, had become a public message. And that message was clear. There is power in vulnerability, strength in survival, and purpose in sharing that strength with the world. But it wasn't just the flower that captured hearts. It was what it represented, the timing, the cause, the symbolism. Catherine had stepped beyond the rigid expectations of royal duty and carved out something more impactful, more human. In doing so, she reshaped how the public saw her, not merely as a future queen, but as a leader in her own right, one who had suffered and chosen to rise, one who understood not just how to wave from a balcony, but how to meet people where they hurt, where they hope, where they heal. And so, as this rose began to bloom across gardens and homes across the UK, so too did Catherine's influence. She wasn't just admired, she was respected. Because when the world watched her falter, she rose without fanfare, only purpose. And with every petal of Catherine's rose, the monarchy took another quiet step toward something new. Something rooted not in tradition alone, but in transformation. Yet, what many missed was this. Catherine's honor wasn't the first of its kind. In fact, it was part of a growing legacy, one that quietly traced through the lives of her children, already blooming with meaning of their own. Long before Princess Catherine's rose took center stage, the tradition of naming flowers after royal family members had quietly blossomed into a symbolic language, all its own, a garden of legacy that grew with every new generation. These weren't random gestures. They were public tributes, botanical markers that etched each royal's presence into the soil of British culture. And like the monarchy itself, each flower told a story, layered, intentional, and deeply personal. A.T. Toit began with a name that carried the weight of expectation: George. The birth of Prince George in 2013 was met with celebration across the Commonwealth, but it was the arrival of the Georgie boy daffodil that quietly cemented his place in a different kind of history. Bright, upright, and unwavering, the daffodil was chosen not just for its springtime beauty, but for its symbolism: sturdy, resilient, and distinctly British. It wasn't just a flower, it was a promise, a nod to the boy who would someday carry the torch into an uncertain future. As thousands of these bulbs were planted across the UK, it was as though the country itself had begun preparing the ground for its next king. 2 years later, in 2015, the arrival of Princess Charlotte brought with it a different kind of bloom, a gentle chrysanthemum in soft pink hues, unveiled just months after her birth. Unlike George's daffodil, this flower carried grace over might. It was refined, graceful, quietly commanding attention without demanding it. The public had already fallen in love with her mother's elegance. Now, they were beginning to see that same poise take root in the next generation. The chrysanthemum, though delicate, had a quiet resilience, much like the girl it represented. Then came Prince Louis, the youngest of the trio, and with him, a bloom bursting with energy. In 2018, the world was introduced to the clematis Prince Louis, a violet flower full of vibrancy, youth, and unpredictable charm. This wasn't a traditional royal bloom it climbed. It stretched. It grew in unexpected directions. And perhaps that was the point. Louis, already known for his cheeky antics and animated presence at public events, had quickly become a fan favorite. His flower wasn't about lineage or legacy, it was about joy. Pure, untamed joy. Taken together, these flowers didn't just represent milestones, they told the evolving story of a royal family, finding new ways to stay rooted in tradition while reaching toward the future. Each bloom whispered something different: strength, grace, spontaneity. And woven through it all was the subtle presence of their mother. Catherine hadn't just nurtured her children, she had helped shape how they were seen, how they were celebrated, and how their legacy would grow, one petal at a time. But while the flowers offered a delicate glimpse into royal affection, the world was beginning to turn its gaze back toward the woman at the center of it all. Because behind the public dedications and polished appearances, something deeper was unfolding. Catherine's public image was soaring, but so too was the curiosity about the life she shared, quietly and fiercely, with the man who once fell in love with her across a university campus. In April 2025, as spring breathed new life into the Highlands of Scotland, Prince William and Princess Catherine marked 14 years of marriage, not with a lavish palace event, but by returning to the EW, place where their story had first begun. It wasn't a grand performance for cameras or a staged gesture for public approval. It was personal, intimate, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come, not just as royals, but as partners. Their journey, once marked by youthful curiosity at St. Andrews, now stood as a testament to resilience, tested by scrutiny, separation, and most recently, by illness that could have broken even the strongest of bonds. But instead, it forged them into something unshakable. Their anniversary was more than a celebration, it was a statement. During their time in Scotland, the couple shared rare moments of openness. Small, fleeting gestures, a touch on the arm, a glance held longer than usual spoke volumes. For a family often trained to mask emotion, their affection was disarming. Catherine, having just emerged from a harrowing battle with cancer, looked to William not as a prince, but as her anchor. And he, in return, carried himself with a quiet protectiveness that didn't need explanation. This wasn't the distant, duty-bound couple that the tabloids once tried to fracture. This was something deeper, stronger, real. Throughout her treatment, William had been her constant. While much of the royal machinery remained tight-lipped, behind the scenes, he was relentless juggling state responsibilities while shielding his children from worry and standing at his wife's side through every hospital corridor. In those silent moments, away from the public eye, the foundation of their marriage was reinforced. And when Catherine returned to the public stage, it was with William close by his presence, a reminder that love, in its truest form, doesn't need words or grand displays. It shows up. It stays. The world watched with admiration. What had once been a fairy tale romance between a commoner and a future king had matured into something far more compelling. A partnership built on sacrifice, trust, and endurance. Their unity in the face of adversity won hearts not just in Britain, but across the globe. They weren't just heirs to a crown anymore, they were symbols of stability in an age of uncertainty. The kind of couple people wanted to believe in. Not perfect, but unbreakable. And yet, beneath all the warmth and admiration, something more subtle was at play. With each public appearance, with each shared glance and joint engagement, Catherine was stepping further into the spotlight, not simply as a supportive wife, but as a royal figure in her own right. As her connection with William deepened, so too did her connection with the role destiny seemed to be slowly shaping for her. And while their bond remained at the heart of it all, it was becoming clear that Catherine's path was no longer just parallel to William's. It was beginning to carve its own trail, one the monarchy could no longer ignore. There was a time when the phrase, "the people's princess," belonged to only one name, Diana. Her compassion, her rebellion against protocol, her tragic downfall, all of it etched her into the hearts of millions. But as the years unfolded and wounds began to scar over, another name started to quietly echo alongside hers. Not as a replacement, but as a rebirth. Catherine. And the resemblance wasn't just in poise or beauty. It was in purpose, in presence, in the way she moved through the world not above it, but within it. Catherine's evolution hadn't come overnight. It wasn't marked by one event or moment, but by a steady crescendo of action, empathy, and clarity of intent. Her calendar swelled with public engagements far more than what was expected of her. Yet each visit, each conversation, each initiative seemed to matter more than the last. From mental health awareness to early childhood development, she didn't just lend her name, she invested her soul. Her speeches, once tentative and rehearsed, grew confident and sincere. She began to speak not like a figurehead, but like someone who had lived through something, learned from it, and now wanted to change the narrative for others. The media, ever hungry for comparison, began to draw parallels. Not in scandal, but in sincerity. Like Diana, Catherine wasn't afraid to kneel beside a child in pain or look a grieving mother in the eye. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to break rules to bend perceptions. Instead, she found a new way, a balance that Diana, perhaps, never had the time to perfect. She walked the line between royal tradition and modern expectation with almost surgical precision. Her wardrobe whispered legacy, her causes screamed relevance, and her silence at times said more than any interview ever could. But it wasn't just admiration that grew, it was expectation. People didn't just like Catherine. They began to look to her, to model her, to wonder openly what kind of queen she might one day become. And behind palace gates, that growing sentiment didn't go unnoticed. In a monarchy obsessed with image, Catherine was now its most potent symbol. She was the monarchy's answer to a changing world, timeless enough to respect the crown, modern enough to redefine it. The more she showed up, the more the public leaned in. The more she endured, the more they invested in her story. And with every step, the shadow of Diana didn't loom. It lit the path. But with that growing light came growing responsibility. Catherine's rising influence wasn't just a personal triumph, it was shifting the monarchy itself. The old guard could feel it. The public demanded more of her, and the institution so often slow to adapt was being pulled along in her wake. And as whispers about succession grew louder, and King Charles's condition stirred unease behind the scenes, the unspoken question began to take form. Was this more than admiration? Was this preparation? Because as Catherine rose to meet the people's gaze, the throne itself was beginning to feel closer. As the monarchy pressed forward through 2025, an uncomfortable truth began to settle over Buckingham Palace, like a fog no one could ignore. King Charles III, though determined and outwardly composed, was no longer the untouchable symbol of royal endurance. Whispers from royal insiders hinted at a reality far more urgent than the polished photo ops suggested. His remission was real, yes, but fragile. And behind those closed, gilded doors, contingency plans were no longer theoretical. They were active. Senior courtiers, long trained to prepare for the inevitable, were suddenly accelerating the quiet machinery of succession. Documents once sealed were being reviewed, protocols dusted off. Not for a state funeral, but for something arguably just as seismic. A premature handover of power. The king had not abdicated, but the question was no longer if it was when. And that question now carried a weight that even his most trusted advisors could feel in every tense conversation, every unspoken pause between meetings. At the heart of this speculation was the couple the world had begun to look at differently, Prince William and Princess Catherine. Once seen as the distant heirs, they were now being subtly positioned not beside the throne, but in front of it. Public engagements multiplied. Their presence at high-level events grew more frequent. The palace communications team, without announcing it, had begun to shift the spotlight. And the world noticed. Headlines across Europe and America didn't ask if William would become king, but how soon. Yet it wasn't just the press feeding the fire. Sources close to the family confirmed that private audiences had taken on a more strategic tone. Legal teams were re-evaluating estates. Military briefings, once reserved for the reigning monarch, were reportedly shared with William. And as these moves became harder to contain, the public's curiosity evolved into expectation. Polls suggested a growing number of citizens favored a peaceful early transition. The monarchy, they believed, needed youth, stability, vision, all of which William and Catherine together seemed to embody. For the royal institution, it was a delicate dance. On one hand, honoring the king's legacy and fight against illness. On the other, acknowledging that the monarchy's survival depended not on nostalgia, but on momentum. Every public step William and Catherine took now seemed rehearsed, yet necessary. A handshake wasn't just a handshake, it was a preview of future rule. A speech wasn't just a speech, it was a test run for leadership. And behind each of these moments, the palace moved quietly, almost cautiously, toward the possibility of the most historic royal pivot in a generation. But it wasn't only logistics and optics that were changing. Beneath the surface, something deeply personal was brewing, something the cameras had yet to fully capture. Because amid the growing political chatter and institutional maneuvering, one moment unexpected and unpublicized would shift the entire tone of this transition. It wasn't William at the center, it was Catherine, and the meeting she was about to have with the king would say more about the monarchy's future than any press release ever could. It happened quietly away from the fanfare, the cameras, and the endless chatter of palace aides. A private lunch, just two people. One a monarch whose reign was suddenly under a shadow. The other, a woman once called common by the royal press, now standing on the precipice of something far greater. When King Charles invited Princess Catherine to dine with him that day, it was not just a gesture of courtesy. It was a moment of consequence. Behind that closed door, something shifted, not just in tone, but in power. And while the palace issued no statement, the ripples of that meeting were impossible to ignore. Speculation erupted almost instantly. What did they talk about? Was it merely a reflection on her recent recovery and return to public life? Or was it something deeper, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the role Catherine was now being groomed to fulfill? For years, she had been seen as the elegant consort, supportive yet secondary. But now, in the wake of King Charles's health battles and William's quiet preparation for the crown, Catherine had become more than just a royal figurehead. She was evolving into a sovereign presence, and the king, it seemed, was ready to say it, if only to her. Royal watchers read between the lines. They analyzed everything, the scheduling, the timing, even the lunch menu leaked by insiders. But the significance wasn't in the details. It was in the symbolism. A king, uncertain of how much longer he could carry the crown, sitting down with the woman who, in the court of public opinion, had already begun wearing it in spirit. The meeting wasn't formal succession planning. It was something far more intimate and far more powerful. It was a reckoning, a recognition, and perhaps a quiet transfer of trust. In the days that followed, subtle signs began to appear. Catherine was granted more solo engagements. Her proximity to the queen consort quietly increased, and her presence beside William felt newly weighted, no longer simply complimentary, but commanding. Commentators began to describe her not just as a future queen, but as a current architect of the royal image. The public, for their part, responded in kind. Approval ratings soared. Polls revealed overwhelming support, not only for William's eventual reign, but for Catherine's leadership beside him. The people weren't just watching her rise, they were rooting for it. And if that lunch was indeed the passing of a torch, it wasn't just from a king to a princess. It was from an era of tradition-bound leadership to a new vision of monarchy, one shaped by empathy, endurance, and grace, forged through adversity. Catherine hadn't asked for power. She earned it, quietly, painfully, brilliantly. And now, the crown may not yet rest upon her head, but the weight of it has already settled on her shoulders. From a university student thrust into global fame, to a duchess shaped by duty, a mother forged by crisis, and a survivor now commanding a nation's admiration, Catherine's story is no longer just about royalty. It is about resilience. It is about transformation. And most of all, it is about the quiet, unstoppable force of a woman who rose not because she reached for power, but because she became impossible to overlook. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.